Marcus Webb couldn't hear the steel doors slam behind him. He couldn't hear the guards shouting instructions. He couldn't hear the other inmates sizing him up as he walked through C Block for the first time. Marcus had been profoundly deaf since birth. What he could do was read lips. Perfectly. In 3 languages. The guards tried to communicate through exaggerated gestures and hastily scribbled notes. Marcus nodded patiently, his eyes tracking every mouth in the room. He saw everything they said, everything they whispered when they thought he wasn't looking. "Easy target," one guard mouthed to another. By day 3, the inevitable happened. Razor Cain, 280 pounds of scar tissue and rage, leader of the Aryan Brotherhood's entire cell block, decided the deaf guy needed to learn his place. He cornered Marcus in the lunch line, his crew of 6 forming a wall behind him. Cain got right in Marcus's face, close enough that Marcus could smell the cigarettes on his breath, close enough to read every syllable. "You're gonna be my bitch," Cain snarled slowly, making sure the deaf man understood. "Nod if you understand me, or I'll beat you until—" Marcus held up one finger. "Wait." Then he pulled out a small notepad from his pocket and wrote something down. He turned it around so Cain could read it. "I understood every word. Did you understand that you just made the last mistake of your life? Stay with me until the end, because what Marcus does next will leave Cain unconscious, his crew terrified, and the entire prison learning sign language just to avoid pissing him off. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The morning Marcus Webb arrived at Riverside Correctional Institution, the intake officer processed his paperwork with the same mechanical routine he'd performed thousands of times before. Another inmate, another number, another problem for someone else to handle. But when the officer looked up from his clipboard and saw Marcus staring directly at his lips with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, he realized this one might be different. Marcus's file told a story that most people would never believe. Born deaf to hearing parents who refused to learn sign language. Bounced between foster homes where nobody bothered to communicate with the silent kid in the corner. By age 12, he'd taught himself to read lips with surgical precision, watching television with the sound off for hours every day until he could understand every word without hearing a single sound. What the file didn't mention was that Marcus had survived on the streets for 8 years before his arrest. 8 years of watching drug dealers whisper threats they thought he couldn't hear. 8 years of seeing police officers coordinate raids they assumed he couldn't follow. 8 years of reading the lips of gang members who spoke freely around the deaf guy, never knowing he understood every plan, every weakness, every secret they revealed. The conviction that brought Marcus to Riverside was armed robbery, but the real story was more complicated. Marcus had watched 3 men planning to assault a deaf girl at a bus stop. He'd read their lips from across the street, understood their intentions perfectly, and decided to act. The robbery charge came when he took their weapons to stop what they were planning. The judge called it vigilante justice. Marcus called it survival. Now, walking through the corridors of C Block, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being surrounded by conversations he wasn't supposed to understand. Inmates muttered about the new fish, guards discussed cell assignments, and everyone assumed the deaf guy was as good as invisible. They had no idea that Marcus was absorbing every word, cataloging every threat, mapping the social structure of the entire cell block through their unguarded conversations. His cellmate was a nervous kid named Danny, who spoke so fast that even hearing people struggled to follow him. Danny had been inside for 6 months on a drug charge and spent most of his time trying to stay invisible. When Marcus walked in, Danny immediately started rattling off warnings about who to avoid, which guards were corrupt, and where the dangerous spots were located. Marcus watched Danny's lips move at machine gun pace and nodded along, but he was really focused on the conversations happening in nearby cells. Tuning in through the thin walls and open doors, he could see inmates discussing everything from contraband locations to planned attacks. Information that would normally take weeks to gather was flowing directly into his mind through their careless assumption that the deaf guy couldn't hear. The first real test came during his second day, when a guard named Officer Rodriguez decided to have some fun with the new arrival. Rodriguez had a reputation for harassment, especially with inmates he perceived as weak or different. He approached Marcus during afternoon count, speaking slowly and mockingly about how deaf people didn't belong in real prisons. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Marcus had already read the lips of 3 other officers discussing Rodriguez's gambling debts, his drinking problem, and his plans to steal from the commissary. Marcus simply smiled and nodded as Rodriguez continued his verbal assault, all while mentally cataloging information that could destroy the guard's career. The dynamics of C-Block revolved around respect, earned through violence or fear. Razor Cain had built his empire by being the most brutal enforcer the Aryan Brotherhood had ever produced. His crew controlled drug distribution, protection rackets, and territory disputes throughout the cell block. Guards looked the other way because Cain kept order through methods that saved them paperwork and overtime. Cain's lieutenant, a wiry psychopath named Snake, first noticed Marcus during shower rotation. Snake prided himself on identifying weakness, and he immediately flagged the deaf guy as potential prey. What Snake couldn't see was that Marcus was reading his lips as he discussed recruitment strategies with another gang member, learning exactly how they selected victims and planned their attacks. The prison's social ecosystem was complex, with different gangs controlling different aspects of daily life. The Mexican cartel ran the kitchen, the black gangs controlled the yard, and Cain's crew dominated the cell blocks. Marcus observed their territorial negotiations through lip reading, understanding power dynamics that most inmates never fully grasped. By his third day, Marcus had identified every major player in the prison hierarchy. He knew which guards were on Cain's payroll, which inmates were planning escapes, and where weapons were hidden throughout the facility. The information flowed constantly through conversations that happened right in front of him, shared by people who assumed their words were safe from the deaf guy's ears. The routine that led to his confrontation with Cain started innocuously enough. Marcus had been standing in the lunch line, patiently waiting his turn, when he noticed unusual activity near the kitchen entrance. 2 of Cain's crew members were discussing a shipment of contraband that had arrived that morning, hidden inside industrial cooking equipment. They spoke freely, assuming the deaf guy behind them posed no threat to their operation. Marcus filed the information away and continued moving through the line. But Cain had been watching the new inmate for days, looking for the right moment to establish dominance. The lunch line provided the perfect opportunity for a public display of power, with enough witnesses to spread word of what happened to anyone who challenged the Aryan Brotherhood's authority. When Cain stepped into Marcus's path, the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned toward the confrontation. Even the guards positioned themselves to watch what everyone assumed would be a quick and brutal lesson in prison hierarchy. But as Cain moved closer, speaking his threats with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged, he had no idea that Marcus was reading every word with perfect clarity. More importantly, Cain didn't know that Marcus had been waiting for this moment since the day he arrived. The cafeteria erupted into nervous laughter as Cain read Marcus's note. The idea that this quiet deaf guy could pose any threat to the most feared man in C-Block struck everyone as absurd. Cain crumpled the paper and let it fall to the floor, his face twisting into the kind of smile that had preceded countless beatings over the years. "You think you're funny, deaf boy?" Cain's lips moved with exaggerated slowness, like he was talking to a child. "Let me explain something real simple. I own this place. I own you. And if you don't get on your knees right now and show proper respect, I'm going to make your life a living hell." Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Cain's mouth. What Cain didn't realize was that Marcus had been reading the lips of his crew members for the past 5 minutes. He knew that Snake was positioning himself for a kidney punch. He knew that Bulldog was ready to grab his arms from behind. He knew that Tiny was blocking the exit to prevent any escape. Most importantly, he knew that Cain always led with his right hand. Always. Snake had been bragging about it just yesterday, describing how their leader dropped new inmates with the same devastating right cross that had earned him his reputation. Cain's crew spread out in a practiced formation, each man knowing his role in what was about to happen. They'd done this dance dozens of times before. The new guy would either submit immediately or get beaten until he learned his place in the food chain. Either way, Cain's authority would be reinforced in front of the entire cell block. "Last chance, freak," Cain snarled, stepping even closer. "Get down or get destroyed." Marcus reached for his notepad again, and Cain's patience finally snapped. The gang leader's massive right fist came flying toward Marcus's jaw with enough force to shatter bone. It was the same punch that had hospitalized 3 inmates in the past year. The same technique that had made Cain the undisputed king of C-Block. But Marcus had seen it coming from the moment Cain's shoulder tensed. 20 years of reading body language with perfect clarity had taught him to recognize aggression long before it became action. As Cain's fist cut through the air, Marcus stepped aside with fluid precision. His movement so smooth it seemed almost casual. Cain's punch hit nothing but air, and his momentum carried him forward into empty space. Before he could recover his balance, Marcus struck with surgical accuracy. His palm drove upward into Cain's throat, hitting a pressure point that instantly cut off the gang leader's air supply. The technique was called the silent strike, something Marcus had learned from a deaf martial arts instructor who understood that deaf people needed to end fights quickly and quietly. Cain's eyes went wide with shock and panic as his windpipe closed. His hands flew to his throat, clawing desperately for air that wouldn't come. The man who had terrorized C-Block for 3 years was suddenly helpless, gasping like a fish out of water while his crew stood frozen in disbelief. Marcus caught Cain as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground while maintaining pressure on the exact spot that controlled his breathing. The entire cafeteria watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous man in the prison lay on his back, completely at the mercy of someone they'd all dismissed as an easy target. "He can't breathe," Snake shouted, finally breaking out of his paralysis. "Let him go." Marcus looked up at Snake calmly, his expression unchanged. Then he did something that sent chills through every witness in that room. He smiled. With his free hand, Marcus pulled out his notepad and wrote a message. He held it up for Snake to read. "Tell your boss that respect is earned, not demanded. When he can breathe again, he'll remember this lesson." Marcus released the pressure point, and Cain immediately sucked in desperate gulps of air. Color slowly returned to his face, but his eyes remained wide with terror. In 30 seconds, everything he'd built through years of violence had crumbled. The aura of invincibility that protected him was gone, shattered by a man who'd never spoken a single word. As Cain struggled to his feet, Marcus stood and straightened his orange jumpsuit. He picked up his lunch tray and walked calmly to an empty table, leaving Cain's crew to help their humiliated leader. The entire cafeteria remained silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. Word spread through Riverside like wildfire. By evening count, every inmate in the facility knew about the deaf guy who dropped Razor Cain without breaking a sweat. The story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained the same. The most feared man in C-Block had been beaten by someone who couldn't even hear his threats. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Cain's crew began questioning their leader's authority for the first time in years. Other gangs started wondering if the balance of power was shifting. Even the guards treated Marcus differently, speaking more carefully around him, suddenly aware that their assumption about his limitations had been dangerously wrong. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Cain wouldn't accept humiliation quietly. The gang leader would need to respond with overwhelming force to restore his reputation, which meant the real confrontation was still coming. And when it did, Marcus would be ready with information he'd gathered by reading the lips of people who thought he couldn't understand their plans. That night, as Marcus lay on his narrow bunk, he reflected on how his disability had become his greatest advantage. In a world where information was power, he had access to secrets that others could never obtain. Every whispered conversation, every muttered threat, every careless admission was his to collect and use. Danny, his cellmate, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Man, everyone's talking about what you did to Cain. They're saying you know some kind of special fighting technique. Is that true?" Marcus pulled out his notepad and wrote, "I know how to listen. That's more dangerous than any fighting technique." Danny read the note 3 times before understanding dawned on his face. The deaf guy wasn't just reading lips. He was gathering intelligence from every conversation that happened around him. He was building a map of the prison's power structure, weakness by weakness, secret by secret. And Cain had just given him the perfect opportunity to use everything he'd learned. The next morning brought an eerie calm to C Block. Cain hadn't shown his face in the common areas since the cafeteria incident, and his crew moved through the corridors like lost sheep without their shepherd. But Marcus knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. Through careful lip-reading, he'd already intercepted 3 separate conversations about Cain's plan for revenge. The first conversation happened during morning count. 2 guards discussing how Cain had requested a meeting with the warden, claiming Marcus was a security threat who needed immediate transfer to solitary confinement. The second conversation took place near the commissary, where Snake was coordinating with members of other white supremacist groups, promising them territory in exchange for muscle. The third conversation was the most dangerous. Cain himself, speaking quietly with a lifer named Psycho Mike about making the deaf guy disappear permanently. What none of them realized was that Marcus had positioned himself perfectly to read their lips from across the yard, his eyes tracking every syllable while appearing to simply watch the basketball game. 20 years of silent observation had taught him that people revealed their true intentions when they thought nobody was listening. And in a place like Riverside, that intelligence was worth more than any weapon. Marcus's reputation was spreading beyond C Block now. Inmates from other sections were seeking him out, curious about the deaf guy who'd humbled Razor Cain. Some offered protection, others wanted to test him themselves, and a few simply wanted to understand how someone with a disability could survive in such a brutal environment. Marcus declined most interactions, but he listened to everything they said when they thought he'd walked away. The most interesting conversation came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the prison librarian, had been watching Marcus during his daily visits to check out books on military strategy and ancient warfare. She knew sign language from working with deaf inmates at other facilities, and she'd been quietly observing his behavior patterns. During a brief exchange where she offered to teach other inmates basic sign language, Marcus read her lips as she spoke to another staff member. "He's not just surviving," Maria had said. "He's studying this place like a general studying a battlefield. I've never seen anything like it." She was right. Marcus had been mapping Riverside's social ecosystem with methodical precision, identifying power structures, alliance patterns, and weakness points that even longtime inmates missed. His silence wasn't submission. It was strategic patience. He was waiting for the right moment to use everything he'd learned. That moment came sooner than expected. On Thursday morning, during breakfast rotation, Marcus noticed unusual movement near the kitchen entrance. Cain's crew was positioning themselves at strategic points throughout the cafeteria, while members of allied gangs took seats at predetermined tables. The setup was subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd been watching their communication patterns for days. The attack was planned for maximum psychological impact. Cain would approach Marcus during the busiest part of breakfast, surrounded by witnesses from every major gang in the prison. The message would be clear: challenge the Aryan Brotherhood's authority and face overwhelming consequences. Other inmates would see what happened to those who stepped out of line. But Marcus had read the planning conversations. He knew that Cain would approach from the left side, that Snake would block the exit, that Bulldog would create a distraction near the serving line, and that the whole thing was designed to look like Marcus started the fight. Cain had even arranged for certain guards to be conveniently absent during the critical minutes. Marcus made his own preparations. He selected a table with clear sight lines to every entrance and positioned himself so that Cain would have to approach from a specific angle. More importantly, he'd spent the previous evening writing detailed notes about everything he'd observed, including guard corruption, contraband locations, and planned gang activities. Those notes were now safely hidden in a place where they'd be found if anything happened to him. Cain entered the cafeteria with the swagger of a man who'd spent 3 sleepless nights planning the perfect comeback. His crew followed in formation, each member knowing their role in the choreographed humiliation that was about to unfold. Other inmates sensed the tension immediately, conversations dropping to whispers as everyone prepared to witness either Cain's triumphant return to power or the complete collapse of the established order. The gang leader approached Marcus's table with deliberate slowness, savoring what he assumed would be his moment of vindication. He'd recruited 12 additional men for this confrontation, including some of the most violent inmates in Riverside. There was no way the deaf guy could fight his way out of this one. "Morning, freak," Cain said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Time to finish what we started yesterday. You got lucky once, but luck runs out real fast in here." Marcus looked up from his breakfast and smiled. Then he did something that made Cain's confident expression falter. He pulled out his notepad and wrote a single word: "Checkmate." Cain laughed, but the sound was forced and nervous. "Checkmate? You think this is some kind of game? I got 15 guys ready to teach you about respect, and you're making jokes about chess?" Marcus wrote another note and turned it around. "I know about the drugs hidden in cell 47. I know about Officer Rodriguez's gambling debts. I know about your plan to frame me for starting this fight. But most importantly, I know you're scared." The color drained from Cain's face as he read the note. How could the deaf guy know about cell 47? That information was restricted to his inner circle, and the thing about Rodriguez was supposed to be completely secret. Cain's eyes darted to his crew members, wondering which one had betrayed him. What Cain didn't understand was that nobody had betrayed him. Marcus had simply been reading lips for 5 days straight, collecting fragments of information from dozens of careless conversations. Piece by piece, he'd assembled a complete picture of Cain's operation, including details that even some crew members didn't know. "You're bluffing," Cain said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no way you could know about any of that stuff." Marcus wrote one more note. "Guard Captain Williams is walking through that door in exactly 30 seconds. Ask him about the anonymous tip he received this morning about contraband in cell 47. Cain spun around to look at the entrance, and sure enough, Captain Williams was striding through the cafeteria doors with a team of correctional officers behind him. They were heading directly toward the table where Cain's crew had been sitting. The table that was adjacent to the contraband storage location Marcus had discovered through lip reading. "How did you?" Cain started to ask, but Marcus was already standing up from his table. The raid happened exactly as Marcus had predicted. Officers went straight to cell 47 and emerged with enough contraband to add decades to multiple sentences. Cain watched in horror as his carefully built empire crumbled in real time, his crew members being led away in shackles while other inmates whispered about how the deaf guy had somehow orchestrated the whole thing. But the real shock came when Captain Williams approached Cain directly. "Razor Cain, you're under investigation for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances within a correctional facility. We received detailed information about your operation, including locations, schedules, and personnel. You have the right to remain silent." Cain's eyes locked onto Marcus, who was calmly cleaning up his breakfast tray. The gang leader realized he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as weak prey. Worse, He'd been defeated without a single punch being thrown. His reputation, his crew, his entire power structure had been dismantled through information warfare by an inmate who couldn't hear a word anyone said. As Cain was led away, Marcus wrote one final note and left it on the table where everyone could see. Silence is golden, but listening is priceless. The aftermath was swift and complete. With Cain in solitary pending investigation and his top lieutenants facing additional charges, the Aryan Brotherhood's control over C Block collapsed overnight. Other gangs moved quickly to fill the power vacuum, but they all did so with a new awareness of the deaf inmate who'd proven that physical strength wasn't the only form of power in prison. Marcus returned to his normal routine as if nothing had happened. He checked out books from the library, attended his assigned work detail, and maintained the same quiet demeanor that had initially made him seem like an easy target. But now, other inmates approached him with respect rather than predatory interest. Word had spread that the deaf guy saw everything, knew everything, and had connections nobody understood. The truth was simpler than the mythology growing around him. Marcus had just been paying attention. While everyone else focused on surviving day to day, he'd been studying the long-term patterns that governed prison life. While others relied on violence and intimidation, he'd built his influence through information and intelligence. Danny, his cellmate, was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Man, everyone's saying you're like some kind of criminal mastermind. They're calling you the Silent Dawn. How did you know all that stuff about Cain's operation?" Marcus wrote his response carefully. "People talk freely around those they think can't hear them. I just happened to be listening." The simple truth was that Marcus had turned his disability into his greatest asset. In a world where secrets meant survival, he had access to information that others could never obtain. Every whispered conversation, every casual admission, every unguarded moment was intelligence he could use when the time was right. And as he settled onto his bunk that night, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Riverside was full of predators who relied on fear and violence to maintain their positions. But fear was just another form of communication, and Marcus was fluent in that language too. He'd read it in Cain's eyes during those final moments in the cafeteria. The prison was learning a new lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who nobody thinks is listening. And Marcus Webb had been listening all along. 3 weeks after Cain's downfall, Marcus had become something of a legend at Riverside. But legends attract attention, and attention in prison usually meant trouble. The new threat came from an unexpected direction. Vincent, the Professor Castellano, had been watching Marcus from the shadows since the cafeteria incident. Unlike Cain, who ruled through brute force, Vincent controlled his territory through intelligence and manipulation. He was serving life for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and he'd built his prison empire the same way he'd built his criminal enterprise. Through information, Vincent had noticed something that others missed. The deaf inmate wasn't just lucky or smart. He was gathering intelligence at a level that could threaten anyone's operation. And that made Marcus either a valuable asset or a dangerous enemy. The approach came during Marcus's daily visit to the library. Vincent slid into the seat across from him, his movements calculated and precise. He was a thin man in his 50s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, he made sure Marcus could read his lips clearly. "Marcus Webb," Vincent said quietly. "We need to talk." Marcus looked up from his book on military history, studying Vincent's face with the same intensity he'd shown Cain. But this felt different. Vincent wasn't posturing or threatening. He was negotiating. "I know what you did to Cain," Vincent continued, his words measured and deliberate. "Impressive work. You've got a talent that could be very valuable to the right people." Marcus pulled out his notepad and wrote, "I'm not interested in joining anyone's crew." Vincent smiled, an expression that never reached his eyes. "I'm not offering you a position, Marcus. I'm offering you a partnership. You see things others can't. I understand how to use that information. Together, We could run this entire facility. The proposition was tempting, Marcus had to admit. Vincent had resources, connections, and the kind of sophisticated operation that could provide protection and privilege. But Marcus had learned long ago that partnerships in prison were just another form of slavery with better terms. He wrote another note. "What makes you think I need your help?" "Because Cain was small time," Vincent replied. "You took down a street thug with anger management issues. But there are bigger players in this game. Players who won't underestimate you the way Cain did. Players who are already planning to eliminate you before you become a bigger threat." Vincent leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "The Mexican cartel is concerned about your intelligence gathering. They're planning something for next week. The black gangs think you're working for administration, and the guards are starting to ask questions about how you knew so much about Cain's operation." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been so focused on Cain's immediate threat that he'd missed the larger implications of his actions. By demonstrating his capabilities so publicly, he'd painted a target on his back that was visible to every power player in Riverside. "You need allies," Vincent continued, "and I need someone with your particular skills. Think about it, Marcus. Together, we could see everything coming before it arrives." That night, Marcus lay awake analyzing his situation. Vincent was right about one thing. Taking down Cain had solved one problem but created several others. Every gang leader in the prison was now reassessing their security, wondering what secrets the deaf guy might have collected about their operations. Danny noticed his cellmate's unusual restlessness. "You okay, man? You've been tossing and turning all night." Marcus wrote a brief note. "Just thinking about the future." But the future arrived sooner than expected. During breakfast the next morning, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Representatives from 3 different gangs were having simultaneous conversations about him, all coordinating their lip movements to prevent him from reading their plans. They'd learned. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His greatest advantage, the thing that had made him untouchable, was now compromised. They were adapting their communication methods, using codes, turning away from him when they spoke, even covering their mouths with hands or objects. Maria Santos, the librarian, confirmed his fears during his afternoon visit. She approached him with a book request form, but when he looked down to read it, the message was entirely different from what she was saying aloud. The written message read, "They're planning something big. Multiple groups working together. Be careful." Meanwhile, she spoke about overdue library books and return policies, her mouth forming completely different words than what she'd written. She'd figured out how to communicate with him safely, which meant others could figure out how to communicate without him. Marcus spent the rest of the day observing communication patterns throughout the prison. What he discovered was troubling. Inmates were developing new methods of sharing information that bypassed his lip-reading advantage. Hand signals, written notes passed during seemingly innocent interactions, even simple gestures that conveyed complex meanings. His intelligence network was being systematically dismantled. Marcus Webb proved that in a world built on fear and violence, the quietest voice can carry the most power. He turned what others saw as weakness into his greatest weapon, showing that true strength isn't about who can throw the hardest punch, but who can see what's really happening when everyone thinks nobody's watching. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they all underestimate.